Now, for more on the COP23 climate talks, I'm joined by David Livingston, Associate Fellow at Carnegie's Energy and Climate Program. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Rachelle.
So, David, what were the main highlights for you from this meeting?
Well, it's the first time we really see the United States acting like a coalition government that you might see out of a European country or what Germany's looking at, in the sense that you kind of have still the traditional apparatus of the climate diplomatic corps there that's left over in the State Department from the previous administration. You have a kind of outside wing of nationalists or populists who are trying to steer a new message and steer the United States participation in a new direction. And then at the same time, accommodated in this strange coalition is the presence, the unprecedented presence of cities, states, corporations, like you just saw on the clip leading into this, that are trying to send a completely different message, and which, in all honesty, probably represent the plurality of the U.S. population and U.S. GDP.
So then, given this unofficial delegation that we saw, obviously business leaders, mayors, even former Vice President Al Gore, we're seeing that they are still committed to the Paris Accord, but how far does that go in offsetting then what the US government is pushing for with its pro-coal message?
Well, like I said, it goes a long way, actually, because you've got, if you take all the companies, the cities, and the states from the United States that are part of this "We Are Still In" coalition, they represent probably, like I said, about half of U.S. population, half of U.S. GDP. And if they were a country altogether, they'd probably represent about the third or fourth largest economy in the world. Now, what they don't account for, however, is the plurality of U.S. emissions. And so there's only so far that a coalition of the already converted can go in terms of actually making a difference in the U.S. meeting its pledges. What's more promising, and perhaps more interesting, actually, despite all of the noise being made by these laudable subnational coalitions, is the fact that 90% of the wind that's to be deployed or in planning right now in the United States, the wind energy, is located not along the more liberal coast, but in the U.S. heartland. And so there's a real changing of the political economy in a number of U.S. Republican-leaning or toss-up states that means that we should expect actually a very different politics of climate change as we head into the midterm elections and the next presidential elections.
Certainly a very different dichotomy there. Now, let's also look at the leadership role that a lot of people say, now that the U.S. has really stepped back from the Paris Accord, also leaves more room for China. We know they have their plans for an initiative for a new national carbon market of putting a price on carbon emissions for companies. What's your take on that sort of strategy?
Yeah, we saw news that China might have a nationwide emissions trading system that you referred to, carbon price, ready by the end of this year. Perhaps will go into effect sometime next year. They also are a leader, this is not mentioned enough, but they're a real leader in green finance and green bonds. The UN Environment Programme's inquiry on the design of a sustainable financial system just had some numbers out today showing that they've got 36 different green bonds issued this year, worth about $12 billion. And that they've got a number of different projects, public-private partnerships of a green or a low-carbon nature in the pipeline, worth up to just short of $1 trillion US. So it's a significant move that China is making to try and take its investment flows and push them in a green direction. Now, there's much work to be done there, and there's a lot of, I think, fuzziness that is yet to be resolved. But clearly, China is, particularly where it sees a coordinated kind of harmony between its own development path in attracting capital and going green, it continues to do that. Now, the real question for China and its leadership role is it stopped building, it canceled about 100 coal plants domestically this year. We'll see more of that stop. More and more renewables are getting deployed in China. What will it do with all of its investment going out in Belt and Road Initiative, going out in the new Silk Road Fund? A lot of people will be watching and scrutinizing that to see if it has a green character to it.
Now, a lot of people are wondering, are we still going to be in the same position next year when we have the next set of climate talks, looking at the next agenda? What sort of changes can we expect between now and then? What sort of concrete outcomes should we be looking at?
Well, we should be looking at, obviously, at the United States right here to see how that position evolves. You sort of see still a sort of palimpsest where the old vestiges of the U.S. Diplomatic core on climate and the U.S. negotiating position are still there, along with some new rhetoric laid on top. We also saw rhetoric, though, saying that the Trump administration is committed to energy innovation, is committed to addressing pollution. What I'd really like to see is, of course, what comes out in terms of concrete policies that meet that rhetoric, so that reality matches the rhetoric. The other thing we should be looking at is, of course, what can come of all these different subnational coalitions within the United States? Will they take on an international dimension where they'll speak with one voice? There's a danger that we have so many different initiatives and coalitions and groups and commitments, right, but it becomes difficult to kind of corral them all in and keep track of, well, who's committing to what and how can they show that they actually achieved it?
So certainly some cohesion needed there. Well, thank you so much. David Livingston, Associate Fellow at the Energy and Climate Program at Carnegie.